Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melinda Salento. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and welcome to today's live stream. Before I start, can I actually begin proceedings by acknowledging the important place that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their communities, their culture and their traditions play in our society and in this nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and future, and just emphasise the importance that reconciliation plays in Australia and the need to move that forward. I'm actually sitting on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I'm sure most of you are scattered around Australia, but we're all meeting on Aboriginal land. Today we're coming to you as a live stream, of course, because we've had to shut down our face-to-face events. And while we've had to do that, of course, CEDA is very focused on how we can continue to bring insights to our members and to the wider community. I think given the uncertainty that we're all facing at the moment, it's probably more important than ever that we endeavour to do that and that we bring a wide range of issues and topics to our members and the community for discussion and debate. You can therefore expect more of the same from us in the coming weeks and months. And we've also been supplementing our live stream events with quite a considerable amount of new content in the form of blogs and podcasts, including a blog by one of our speakers today. And all of this can be accessed at our website, ceda.com.au. And of course, all the information about future live streams is available at ceda.com.au as well. One of the key features of CEDA's face-to-face events, of course, is the opportunity for people to be able to engage in the conversation itself, to ask questions as they go through the event. And I just wanted to let you know that you'll be able to do that today as well. If you're interested in asking a question, all you need to do is click the link on your screen, the bottom of your screen, and simply add your question. That question will find its way to me, and subject to having plenty of time at the end, we'll run through your questions and our panellists will provide you with their thoughts and insights on the issues that are important to you. Our topic today is, of course, China's rebound and what that means for business in Australia. China really was the first country, obviously, into this crisis. Like everyone else, it's been very hard hit by the crisis, both in terms of health outcomes and their society, but also in terms of the really significant adverse economic impacts. But having been the first country in, it's now looking like China will be the first country out as well. And people are now starting to consider what that economic recovery looks like, what the rebound might look like and what that means for a business. And that, of course, is fundamentally important to Australia, given the important relationships that we have with China, both in terms of trade, but also investment. Joining me for our discussion today, two fantastic speakers who are bringing very different insights, really, academic and business perspectives. But first, let me introduce Professor Jane Golly, who is the Director of the Australia Centre on China in the World at the Australian National University. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
And then we've got Doug Ferguson, who is the New South Wales Chairman and Head of Asia and International Markets for KPMG. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Melinda. Thanks, everyone.
Jane, let's start with you. Perhaps you might kick our conversation off by giving us a little bit of sort of slightly longer term context on the Chinese economy, the performance of that economy, and sort of how that's taken us to where we are now. We'll come to the here and now of the crisis, but perhaps just a few perspectives to get us going.
Sure. Thanks, Melinda, and thanks, CEDA, very much for having us on the show today. Where to start? I've been tracking the Chinese economy for about 25 years now, and it's been a real success story for a huge amount of that time, with double-digit growth rates in the 1990s. Of course, that growth slowed down in the last 6 or 7 years or so, and the Chinese government's very deliberately promoted this idea of the new normal rate of growth at around 6 to 7%. I think it's taken Australians quite a lot of time to even get used to those what I'm now going to call the old normal rates of growth, because we're not going to see those again in the future. But, a lot of the reason behind that growth has been really rather natural, that you've seen a significant slowdown in the growth of the population and the labour force in China. That included getting near the exhaustion of the vast rural labour surplus that fueled a lot of the labour-intensive development in the past. They very deliberately shifted or been trying to shift towards higher value-added and greener growth. And coupling that with a rebalancing of the economy towards domestic consumption to try and reduce that reliance on the global economy. A lot of this can work well in China's favour, I think, in the time coming ahead. But from Australia's perspective, the business sector has very clearly benefited, and in fact, almost all Australians have benefited from China's rapid growth in the past. But I think what we've really seen in the press and in political and academic circles in recent years has been this sort of continual question about whether we're excessively dependent on China, whether our reliance there is a huge problem, how we can diversify away from that economy. And of course, that's been heightened by the fact of the rising tensions between the United States and China, our number one ally and our number one trading partner, coming into all sorts of conflict that I don't think is going to disappear in the future. Now, the key point I made in my CEDA short piece that I wrote was that diversification makes great sense in theory, but I think it's going to prove very difficult in practice given the situation that we all find ourselves in today. And I came to that point really letting the numbers speak for themselves, and I won't reel through them now, but the essential point was that China's economy is so large and so important to us in trade and investment terms that even if growth there slows, and it clearly will in the year ahead and the years ahead, it still seems to be Australia's best bet for sustaining our own economic growth rates in the future. So I guess my opening key point is that China might have gotten us into this crisis, but I also think it's the country that is most likely to lead us out of it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. And I think a really good way to sort of start the conversation, actually, understanding a little bit more about how China's transformed itself and been seeking to transform itself and how Australia has benefited. Doug, I suspect you would have a similar sort of perspective, but maybe you might like to just give us a little bit more of a business take on that to sort of start us off from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. Thanks, CEDA, and thanks to all of you who have dialed in at lunchtime to listen to this speech. I lead our Asia international business, and that enables me to speak with a lot of Australian companies that are operating in Asia and exporting to the region, and also helping a lot of Chinese companies that are operating in Australia, having made their investments here. So I come at this conversation very much from a business perspective. And so my opening remarks are, Australia is an exporting nation, and we're heavily dependent on China for our revenues. The IMF expects our economy to contract 6.7% in 2020. That's worse than the US and the EU. So the reality is Australian exporters are facing into a very difficult near-term future. And despite lots of geopolitical concerns and media coverage, I think the business community is and needs to be absolutely pragmatic and focus our efforts on carefully managing the China and Asian trade for our own survival. There's no denying China's vital importance to Australia. I think Jane mentioned in 2019 alone, our exports to China grew 26% to 153 billion, which is 33% of our total exports. And on top of that, Chinese companies have invested over 110 billion US dollars into Australia since 2008. Jane talked about diversification. This is not a new concept. Most of our senior political and business leaders have been concerned about an overdependence on China for a number of years now. That's why we've successfully completed the multilateral trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also important bilateral FTAs with Japan, with Korea, with Indonesia, with Latin America, with Hong Kong, and we're continuing efforts with India. But while these other markets, including Japan at 61 billion of export revenues a year, South Korea at 27 billion, and India at 23 are important, they frankly haven't offered the same scale or growth rate as China has. nor does, frankly, Hong Kong, Singapore, or Taiwan, which each equate to approximately about 10% of annual China exports. So it's easy to say we should diversify away, but very hard practically and economically to do, especially during a crisis, and given that much of ASEAN and our region is locking down its borders. In the meantime, throughout all of this, China continues to buy our iron ore, LNG, and food. And it looks as it's at this stage as if China is going to be the first major economy out the other side. But the risk of further outbreaks within China are real, particularly as hundreds of millions of workers go back to their factories across the country. So it would be extremely premature to assume that this crisis is over for China and it's back to normal. But recent data is encouraging in terms of low infection rates. Really, the key challenge for China and for businesses going forward is that most of the regional supply chain has been disrupted throughout ASEAN, and they have very sluggish domestic consumption rates. While most of the Asian region is shutting down its borders, just as China is coming back online, who will China sell to and who will they trade with given this? So my key message before pausing again is to the business community, we should focus on what we can control and keep a pragmatic mindset. Given the very difficult set of economic realities that we face, we need to maintain a clear-eyed, pragmatic view on China and our commercial relationship with China and keep working hard at it. We need to understand exactly what's going on there as much as possible. And unless geopolitical circumstances materially change, we simply can't afford as an economy to attempt to rapidly decouple our trade relationship from China. The economic costs would be simply too severe for our Australian people. So I'll pause there and come back to more detailed questions.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and thanks to both of you. Really interesting start to the conversation. So much in there already. I mean, Doug, I think it's really interesting. You drew on the IMF numbers, the global growth forecasts. Of course, for the globe overall, they're projecting numbers that we haven't seen the likes of since the Great Depression. So we're in for a hefty shock. Australia's GDP numbers, as you noted, are really far worse than many of the developed countries for this year, this calendar year. But when you look at what the IMF is expecting for next year, of course, our rebound is much sharper. And I think that's tied to very, very much so to the outlook for China. So Jane, maybe we might put a few more numbers around this, or just a bit more context around, what exactly has the Chinese economy been through in the last 6 months? What does that mean for economic growth this year? And then maybe we'll come back and talk about risks for next year. But maybe just talk a little bit about how they're feeling right now.
Well, as you said, it's the biggest shock to the global economy probably since the Great Depression. China's lived through another really huge shock later than that, and that was during the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s. It cost some 30 to 50 million lives and wasn't, of course, caused by a pandemic, but by some pretty bad planning mistakes combined with some natural disasters that kind of rippled through the country. So China's certainly used to dealing with difficult shocks, and this one is right up there. I mean, I think we won't reel off too many of the numbers. We've seen the official estimates for the first quarter, a 6.8% drop in GDP, massive declines in retail sales and industrial output, declining both by over 15%. The unemployment figures are up at 6.2% for the official numbers. Of course, it's likely to be much higher than that. And as Premier Li Keqiang famously, and I think regrettably said many years ago now, these numbers, official numbers coming out of China, are best for reference only. What we know is that the economy has taken a serious hit, and I'm sure everyone listening today has been reading all about that. In terms of COVID-19, I did hear just yesterday that there is now only one district of 3,000 zones in China. Beijing's Chaoyang district is the only high-risk COVID-19 zone left in the country, and so there has, that's a really good sign that they've brought the infection rate under control. And what's followed from that pretty quickly is an economic recovery. It's not complete. We know that the shops and the restaurants are reopening, although people have been pretty cautious and reluctant about getting back out there. We know that most companies are back operating, although not at full capacity. And we also know that the risk of reinfections and new lockdowns taking place, is quite possible. Now, I think it's really dangerous for anyone to make growth forecasts, and especially economists. We notoriously get them wrong. We've got the World Bank forecasting 2.3% as a baseline scenario for this year. Their worst case scenario for China is a 0.1% increase in output over the course of this year. And I think the IMF is in roughly that same ballpark. What I think is that the Chinese government is very unlikely to settle for this outcome. They've got a target rate themselves of 5.6%, so they've already come down from that new normal of the past. I think they're likely to reduce that to 5%, and they may have a very hard time hitting that mark. But I would say that they're the masters of fiscal stimulus, and they are really the masters of a whole range of government tools, which we can talk more about. Tricks that they've got up their sleeve to boost growth beyond that if they can. I'm not saying they can definitely make it substantially higher, but I think they'll continue to grow this year faster than just about any other economy in the world. So what we need to do is get ready, as I said, for that new normal to become the old normal. And I don't want to guess what the new normal is, but I also don't mind being wrong. I reckon, if they get 4 to 5%, we will be incredibly lucky. It's likely to be lower than that.
Thanks, Jane. Doug, from a business perspective, you'll be talking to people that regularly do business with China. How are you feeling about the green shoots that we're starting to see coming out of China? There's talk about production kicking up, facilities, the lights are on. Who knows what's actually happening behind closed doors in terms of how quickly production's ramping up? What are you hearing, and how confident are you about that? And what do you think that means for business here in Australia in the next 3 to 6 months?
Well, there's lots of sources of credible information, both within China and externally. Lots of great research coming out. There's lots of data available to suggest an overall picture of China's manufacturing sector getting going in a big way. So, Trivium China, which is a major research institute, reckons that 95% of the largest Chinese companies have resumed normal operations or operating at between 80 and 85%. Most of the major provinces in China are now out of lockdown, and people are getting back to work. There's obvious stories and concerns around the reliability. We attended an interesting and useful briefing hosted by Auscham a few weeks ago, where DFAT and Austrade representatives mentioned that there's widespread evidence of Chinese government inspectors checking factories within the larger companies to ensure that there's genuine activity, given that subsidies are being paid by the government to these companies. So there's lots of checks and balances. There's lots of different points of data. I guess what we can say is that Chinese ports are all open again. Most of the problems, frankly, for Chinese ports are at the overseas destinations. The Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI, which was in uncharted territory in February at 35.6, has rebounded into positive territory at 52 in March, which is good to see. Interestingly, high-tech manufacturing sector grew by close to 9% in March. The output of power generation equipment has gone up 20% in March. E-commerce has been booming. Online sales of physical goods expanded by about 6% overall in Q1. So in terms of green shoots, it looks pretty good. I saw a stat that automobile sales, people have come out of lockdown and apparently all gone and bought new cars, because that's up 360% or something like that for the month of March. So that combined with a reduction in the unemployment rate is positive, and we've seen a clear focus from the Chinese president on boosting consumption, ramping up investment into new infrastructure, spurring private investment, stabilizing the job market, and guaranteeing the security of food and energy. So lots of really positive things, although lots of challenges. And as I said before, they're no way out of the COVID scenario yet.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I mean, we can maybe when we finish up, we can have a little conversation about what we think is going to be sales out of the gates here in Australia when activity gets up and running again. It's interesting that it's cars in China. Let me just pick up on the comment you were talking about in terms of efforts to boost consumption. I think, Jane, one of the big questions, I think there's a presumption always with China that growth comes first and that the Chinese government will do absolutely whatever it can to get growth numbers up, and not just numbers but genuine activity. But one of the big questions, I guess, has been that as the government has really tried to reshape domestic demand and to really contribute to consumer-led activity and to see that shift in the economy, that it's perhaps weakened some of the levers that they've typically had to re-energise industrial production, and that the levers to stimulate the consumer are not as direct. What do you think about that, and to what extent does your faith in the ability of the Chinese government to ignite growth still exist? You spoke about it. You think they've got a lot of tools in their kit bag. What do you think they are?
Well, gosh, it's difficult to know where to start with that. I mean, if you think about how one of the biggest risks they're facing is how they boost both consumer and business confidence in the months ahead. And as I said, I would call them the masters of fiscal stimulus. And Doug's already mentioned a few of the things that they've got that they're already promoting there. There is talk of a huge, a 2.8 trillion yuan fiscal package, which would amount to about $400 billion US, be supported by local government bond sales. And the focus on these new infrastructure projects that they're talking about. So not quite like the GFC fiscal stimulus of the past that really pushed those hard infrastructure projects, and that the Chinese government's particularly good at getting out, channeling it through state-owned enterprises and releasing that credit through the state-controlled banking sector. And that still remains one of the primary levers that they've got. They don't have as much capacity as they did in the past with the GFC because of both the rising debts of the central and local governments, and also, a much trickier job without the external demand coming from the rest of the global economy. In terms of consumption, we've already seen a few targeted measures targeting, I think, especially the poorest people in China, and there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of them, and I think they are one of the keys to coming out of this crisis. They link into that rebalancing towards domestic consumption. If you can get those hundreds of millions spending, that's going to be a really good thing for the domestic economy. And so, for example, by waiving social security fees, by cancelling utility bills, and by trying to channel some of that credit into small and medium enterprises and away from the big state-owned enterprises, there are a couple of examples of how consumer confidence can be restored. In terms of business confidence, the state-owned enterprise sector has really struck back, you could say. Nick Lardy wrote a book on that just last year about the state striking back and how powerful and really strong the SOEs have become in recent years. And what we could see, and what would be fantastic for the Chinese economy and for the rest of the world as well, is that they return to a renewed stress on the supply side structural reforms that they've been talking about for years and not progressing with that quickly. These are reforms designed to boost productivity and efficiency, and a great example is of the private sector and the small and medium enterprise sector. Nick Lardy in that book did a back-of-the-envelope calculation and basically said that if China reformed all of its SOEs, they would get 2 percentage points more growth out of the economy. Now, I think that's a contentious question. If they really could do that, why aren't they doing it? And there are reasons behind that. Their commitment to socialism with Chinese characteristics, and Xi Jinping's, I think, very personal commitment to the strength of the state sector. But still, when push comes to shove, and that's a situation that we find ourselves in, we might see more reforms that provide another source of boosting growth in the year and years ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, maybe some similar conversations we can have about reform in the Australian economy and estimates about what that might deliver. Both of you, in your opening comments, spoke about this issue of diversification. And there's just no escaping the fact that the really sharp collapse in economic activity in China really sent shockwaves through the Australian economy and Australian business. I think it highlighted the extent of our reliance, and there's obviously been a whole conversation that's now been ignited about security of supply chain, particular products and the like. Can we just come back to that conversation now? And Doug, let me flip to you first. I think you both sort of started by saying, let's be pragmatic and realistic about this.
Yep.
I think equally there is a sense that we do need to diversify.
Yep.
So what does, well, and you know, if you want to, you can speak to this sort of slightly louder voices that we're hearing now around this whole notion of potentially even decoupling from China. Can we just, you know, can I get your perspectives on, if it's not decoupling, if we have to be pragmatic about the benefits, what does diversification look like?
Yeah, well, I think my points were that we need to be pragmatic and continue to build the China business. You know, we have exports of 153 billion, of which 110 billion are natural resources, you know, mining, gas, etc. That's incredibly important for our country. So is the 15 billion in agricultural exports. You know, China's demand for our safe premium food is probably higher now than ever, and provided we can get the product on planes and into China, then that's a very strong growth area for Australia's economy, and great for our food growers as they come out of a terrible drought and bushfire. The diversification debate, I completely agree with. I think we want to find growth areas in other markets. It's just that it's not easy to do quickly. You know, our relationship with Japan and South Korea is incredibly important. We've signalled our great intent on Indonesia. Indonesia's not even in our top 10 export markets at the moment, but it requires a national effort to get it up and going in the next 5 years. India, again, incredibly important for Australia's future, given the young population and the opportunities there around their wealth generation. But you know, diversification is always a smart thing, but it takes time. We need to keep eye on building and securing our China trade as well. I just don't buy into the debate at the moment unless there is a very, very critical reason to talk about decoupling. I just don't buy into that. It just doesn't make sense for Australia. It might have sense for some Northern European, Northern Hemisphere countries, but Australia's economically so closely aligned to China, and China's incredibly connected throughout Southeast Asia with its manufacturing and supply chain routes. We need to continue to manage those economic interests on Australia's behalf very carefully. So I know that our political leaders here in Australia are being tested. It's been a difficult relationship to manage over the last 3 to 4 years, but on the whole, I think they're doing a very good job, and I think the Australian business community understands the complexity that they face, and that we are doing our bit to focus on what we can control, which is maintaining a number of relationships while continuing to try and grow new ones in high growth areas where there's young, vibrant, wealthy populations that need what Australia can export.
Jane, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I've got so much I could say on this topic. I think the first point that I'd really like to stress is that I think economists have been culpable, and I'll put myself in that category of really pushing quite myopically the benefits of free trade. And I'm not sitting here today to say that we should just have this completely open trading relationship and investment relationship with China, that there aren't security considerations that we really need to take seriously. And you know, that's come up in recent years with the direction that Xi Jinping's taken the Chinese economy and society on. It's also a result of the rising tensions, as I've mentioned, between the US and China. What I think we've seen in Canberra is the balance shifting too far towards the security side of things, this call for decoupling without stopping to consider really seriously just how much that would cost the Australian economy, and you know what that means for the people and for the livelihood of people across the country. So I think there's a real need to strike a better balance than we have in the past. You know, 2 decades of focusing entirely on the economic benefits that our engagement with China could bring, and now with COVID-19, I think really bringing to the foreground not just the security risks of the traditional security risks of dealing with what we might reasonably call now a non-ally, but also encompassing these much broader human security or health risks, that come with living in an extremely globalised world. I don't think we're going to return to the world of the past. I think the neoliberal globalised order that we've become so used to and that's been so beneficial for Australia really is not going to return. But I can also start to look on the bright side of that the economic and security experts here in Canberra and across the country come together and have more nuanced conversations about the balance that we need to strike. I'll put in a bid here for a recognition of the fantastic job that our bureaucracy and the government is doing in dealing with the crisis, and even in maybe starting to look at China's own methods of stimulating growth, not that we'd resort to all of them, but acknowledging that actually having a strong government in a time of crisis can actually be a good thing.
Yeah, geez, so much in that, Jane. I think we'll come back another day to talk about the government response. And I think, as we look to recovery, one of the things that I think is on a lot of our minds is how we take what's the good out of what's happened. It's been a terrible crisis, but some of the responses have been, the response here has been fantastic. Not just government, but I think the way people have lent in as well. And so I think that's a pretty interesting message that maybe strays a little bit off topic, but worth emphasising right here and now. I'm going to flip to some questions now. And there's a couple of things that we had on our list that we were going to talk about. I'll make sure we come back to them, but some of our audience is sort of picking up on some really important themes, I think. In no particular order necessarily to how they've come in. Let me start with a question from Yannick. And as I'm sorry to the audience, as you see my eyes drifting up, I am looking at these questions on another screen. So let me explain that. We've got a question from Yannick directed to you, Jane, around if there's this great push to support economic growth, what does that mean in terms of trade, but also foreign direct investment into Australia? And Doug, I'll make sure you get a chance to come in on that piece too, because I know it's a really important one for you. But so, if we can put numbers on the table, 5% growth in China next year, 6%, 4%, what does that mean for us?
I think in terms of the business response to that, I'll defer to Doug. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not trying to give a solid forecast for what I think China's growth will be. I've laid out a whole bunch of possible ways in which the Chinese government could stimulate growth. We know the sorts of areas of the economy that they're likely to target, the high-tech sector, the green economy. So you can start to think of places where Australians businesses could take advantage of that and where trade is likely to pick up. There are other areas that are likely to remain flat. And again, it's not really my position, I think, to try and forecast those. But I think there'll be pockets of opportunity for trade expansion and also for Chinese investment. Now, the investment part, I think, is worth unpacking a little bit. China, of course, has been one of the major foreign investors into this country in recent years. It's still only the 5th largest stockholder. The US is well up the top there. But China is basically the most likely country, I think, to have funds to invest in the year ahead. It might have something to do with why the Treasurer has recently announced a temporary change to the foreign investment proposal system here in the country, basically to ensure that all foreign investments, whatever the level of the investment, as scrutinised to make sure that there's not a huge sell-off of Australian assets. That makes sense from a political perspective. I think we want to be careful to signal and to continue to signal to China that we're still open for their investment. But we could also expect to see that investment falling for a couple of reasons. And the first one comes back to this rebalancing idea. If you have a Chinese government who's trying to encourage its consumers to spend more domestically, then the flip side of that is that they spend less abroad, and they spend less abroad in terms of the goods that they might choose to import more traded goods. But the consequence of that is that they have less savings. So China's been a massive global contributor to global savings for the last decade at least. They've been pressured by the US to do less of that. They've been pressured to appreciate the renminbi over time so that they could buy more goods. But the sort of long-term implications of China's rebalancing means they'll have less investment to distribute across the globe. They've already reduced their foreign assets from, I think, $3.8 trillion a peak in 2014. It's down to 3.1 trillion by the end of 2019. I think it'd make sense for them internally to redirect a fair bit of that foreign investment back into Chinese markets, which again would shrink the pool available of their capital going elsewhere in the world. So there are a whole bunch of different factors that are going to affect what opportunities we've got. I think for those Australian companies that are wanting capital investments, China's still going to be the place to look.
Thanks, Jane. Again, a lot in that too, and I think this point about implications for global capital flows is, obviously fundamental for Australia as a capital importer, and so really, really important for us, but also just for global financial stability more broadly, which I think is an issue sort of lurking out perhaps in a few months and into next year and beyond. Doug, just interested in your perspectives on that investment piece, but also if I can tie in a link to another question here, which I think Jane sort of touched on as well, is that I think there's a tendency when we think about what all this means for exports and trade in Australia to sort of look at what we've done in the past. But I think it's always good to look at where there's new opportunity and if there's, for want of a better description, some silver lining out of this crisis. And I think you've got some ideas about not just the implications for traditional trade relationships with China, but where we might find some new opportunities. So perhaps if you could touch on the investment piece and that as well, that would be great.
Sure, Melinda. The traditional business has been built around natural resources, as I mentioned. I think it's very exciting to see the opportunities for Australia's participation in China's renewable energy sector. So all of the components that go into making batteries or making renewable power, Australia's actually got very deep resources in lithium, in nickel, copper, obviously. Iron ore and coal and coking coal go into the infrastructure growth story and the recovery that China will be no doubt planning. There's an increasingly favourable outlook for LNG. Australia supplies 40% of China's LNG, so that's very good. What is going to be a timing issue, I think, rather than a permanent issue, is the return to tourism and tertiary education. I'm sure we'll want to talk about that further, but that's really dependent, I think, on borders opening, national borders, and flights resuming, and that could be a pause of some time into 2021, in fact. Where we're also seeing, as I mentioned before, great export demand is in our meat and in our food industry generally. So I think Australia has the ability to produce enough food on its current platform for about 75 million people. It's far beyond our nation's need for feeding ourselves. So to continue to export our food is an enduring story for us. Then, of course, it's our services economy. We are incredibly good in food security, in biosecurity, in cold chain logistics, in waste and water management. And those are exactly the sorts of services that I think coming out of China's COVID experience that they'll be looking to source internationally. So great opportunities there for our service providers. Just on the inbound investment, we've obviously tracked this carefully over the last decade with Sydney University at KPMG. We've seen over the last 2 years a very significant reduction in Chinese direct investment into Australia. It's not really our fault. What has actually happened is a very deliberate set of policies in China to slow down the outflow of capital as they want to continue to prop up their domestic equity and bond market and redirect investment into the Chinese economy. Also, for the SOEs that were originally very large investors in Australia, they have turned their attention to the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are a lot of issues around foreign investment, which Jane has pointed to, but Australia is still very much open for business. We're still seeing Chinese companies interested in investing into renewable energy, into our healthcare sector, into our food and agribusiness sector as well. So it just may be a much quieter period over the next year or two than we've perhaps experienced during the peak from 2008 to 2015, let's say.
Thanks, Doug. Can I just get you, and I'll go back to Jane on this as well, but let's just talk about tourism and education in particular. You know, when we were catching up in the lead up to this live stream, Doug, you were sort of talking about some numbers around the number of Chinese students who are still in Australia, and I think that number might be surprising to many. But, you know, is this a case that borders remain closed and that's the end of the story, or is there an opportunity? Do we think that students will come in at some point, sit under quarantine and then re-engage? How are we thinking our online learning is going for that market? I'd be interested in your perspectives, Doug, and then yours as well, Jane.
There simply isn't much to look forward to until flights resume on any sort of normal scale. So the flights have essentially stopped. The only people that are moving between countries now are Australian expatriates coming back to Australia and Chinese expatriates going back to their country. So that's a key issue. I was made aware again by DFAT that approximately 54% of Chinese students enrolled are actually now in Australia and able to resume studying, and then there's a healthy proportion that have agreed to study remotely while they're in China. So certainly all is not lost there, but until borders open, clearly our tourism and our tertiary education sector will be limited. So will our food sector. A lot of our food and emergency equipment goes in the underbelly of aircraft. They aren't flying at the moment. It's fantastic that the federal government announced last week a $110 million program to fund freight aircraft to take food into China, but there's going to need to be a lot more of that sort of activity to be able to enable us to reach our dreams of exporting, you know, more to China in terms of services and also perishable food.
Jane, just quickly, if you've got something to add to that, and then I'm going to turn to a couple of more of the geopolitical questions I've got on my list.
I'll try to be quick, but of course the education sector is pretty close to my heart, and I think it provides a really good lens into this question of dependence on China, but it's also a very particular sector. I mean, as Doug said, if about half the Chinese students are here, it still means that there are about 100,000 sitting in China who are unable to come back. And there's also, I've read a few surveys recently about a large number of Chinese students across the world wanting to get back to China because they think that's the safest place to be at the moment. But on the question of dependence, I think COVID gives us an insight into what would happen if we did decouple from China or try to reduce that. The university sector is estimating a loss of about 21,000 jobs if the Australian government doesn't increase its support. You know, we're being decimated with revenue declines of well over 3 billion, hundreds of millions in losses coming out of expected for my university alone. And the government has stepped that up. And I think this is what's particular about the education sector. You know, we're particularly reliant on the Chinese economy because funding to the sector has been reduced over the years. And what we could see in this case is more government support for both education, but also all of the research that's conducted in the universities. And so they're kind of offer us an alternative to dependence on Chinese students in particular for our revenue bases. And that'd be a really positive thing to come out of the crisis for the Australian university sector, allowing us more independence while still figuring out how to provide, you know, the best education services that we can, because it is our most important service export.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And I think, Doug, you know, the numbers, I don't think everyone is perhaps quite aware of how many students are still here and studying. It sort of puts a bit of weight behind some of the calls from the universities around the need to think about the support we might need to provide to foreign students, or to think at least about the experience that they're having, given that the opportunity for them to work has been so constrained, and how they're supporting themselves with you know, less support, obviously financial support being delivered from home, given the circumstances there. It's a complex issue, and one that is pretty important, as Jane said, to a really important export market. We do have quite a few questions here that sort of touch on the politics and the geopolitics of this. So let's go to some of those, and I'm going to combine a couple if I can. I've got a question from Rebecca and a question from Eric Rebecca's question is really around, what are the implications about the sort of political finger pointing, and I think that's around the world really, around the handling of the virus, but then what that means for the relationship between Australia and China, and in particular the relationship with business. So Jane, perhaps you first, and Doug, if you wouldn't mind coming in at the end around what the business perspective on that is.
There's no doubt that the political tensions between the US and China are, I'd say, at an all-time high, but I also expect that they're going to get worse in the time ahead. We can talk more about that if that's where the questions want to go, but I want to actually share a bit of really good news that I've got on this front, and I have a PhD student, Rajesh Agarwal. He's doing some absolutely brilliant work looking at the relationship between political relations and trade relations between countries with a focus on China. And he covers the period from 1998 to 2018 in a technical analysis that goes far above my head in some ways, but the key messages from that are really clear, and that is that even when political relations are damaged, and he tracks those really clearly over time, the trading relations between countries, and he's looking at bilateral pairs, so China-India, China-US, China-Australia, and so on, that actually the trade relationship is really resilient to that. So in other case, whatever's going on at the top, the business people find a way to continue to build the relationships that bring them prosperity and wealth. Doug might be able to add to that point, but I think, we've got to look for silver linings in those. And it's a really contentious and I think important debate. It's not that his findings end that. It's a 200-year-old debate about whether trade will bring countries closer together and cement positive political relations. Well, that clearly hasn't happened in the case of US and China over the last 30 years, but it might have existed at some points in time. The idea that those political relations and economic trade relations, and possibly investment as well, can be separated is a silver lining in the cloud.
Doug?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, for that question. Look, I don't think Australia is necessarily leading debate at the moment around seeking truth around the origins and the original treatment of the COVID-19 virus. We're simply seeking to understand, how to learn and what to do from here. Clearly, the atmospherics do matter to business between, government to government relationships. That's been reported to us consistently by Australian company executives that are operating in China. Chinese are very sensitive to our media cycle, as I think Australia's starting to become more sensitive to China's media cycle. So there's all sorts of issues within that, but ultimately our trading relationship is built upon complementarity of needs, and as Jane pointed out, our business with China has continued to grow at over 20% per annum over the last 2 or 3 years during a period, frankly, where relationships have been quite strained. And that's been out of economic necessity on both sides and independence there. What we do tend to see with these sorts of things is challenges around non-tariff barriers for Australian exports that are trying to get into the Chinese market. So there's sometimes some concerns from the Australian side around lack of understanding of sudden changes in tariff, non-tariff issues, and also we tend to see a significant change in direct foreign investment from China when there is serious relationship issues, and I don't think, as I tried to frame before, that Australia is on its own. China has clearly moved its direction and has also started to put more emphasis on the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's lots of things that come into play, but I would point out atmospherics definitely do matter. We would prefer to see private and stable relationship and conversations rather than megaphone diplomacy on either side, and we'd very much like to see a better understanding of what sort of non-tariff technical issues the Chinese regulators are seeing so that we can adapt and continue to supply.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I mean, the question that Eric had asked too, which was a much more specific one, I guess, was really around, is it acceptable that this political relationship seems as poor as it is, that there isn't much of a relationship between MPs and the People's Congress? Eric's referencing the fact that our Prime Minister is one of the few G20 leaders that hasn't had direct contact with the Chinese leadership throughout this crisis. Jane, I think you're saying, there's evidence to suggest that business gets on with it. Doug, what do you think? Is this something that, business is saying to the government that this is an important relationship that needs to be repaired, or is that something for down the track, or is business just getting on with it?
And the government are acutely aware. Oh, sorry, I'm muted. I'm unmuted now. Okay, we're acutely aware of the importance of China and our relationship. So I don't think the business needs to lead on this, and I certainly don't need to add too much more to this. All I've said before is that it's incredibly complex. That Australia is just one of many nations that are dealing with a changing China, and I think doing it increasingly in a very positive, constructive manner.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Jane, can I flip this around to you, because one of the other questions from Mike is around. I'll come back to Mike's question. There was one question about what the implication is likely to be for tourists coming back into Australia when restrictions are limited, are relaxed, and so how does this play to the Chinese market? Is that relationship piece likely to impact their enthusiasm for coming to Australia, or is it just we're such a fantastic place to come, we didn't worry about it?
Yeah, if you like bushfire and hail sort of tourism, then maybe we're a good place to come visit at the moment. I don't want to make that a flippant comment. I think our tourist industry has taken just the most massive hits, and unfortunately I think that's where we've got a real challenge in the time ahead. I just want to stress, I'm not saying that the political relationship doesn't matter. I'm not an economist who takes econometric numbers and then believes them, that they tell the whole truth about everything. I think the messaging from the very top of government all the way through the bureaucracy is supremely important in terms of how the Chinese government views us and the messaging that they then deliver to their people. And one of the ways that they've got to deliver that message, or the biggest way really, is through the state-controlled media. And so when we have a political kerfuffle at the very top, that often translates into headlines in the Global Times, for example, and the People's Daily back home, headlines that Australia is an unfriendly place, or that we're not welcoming. They'll go as far as saying we're a dangerous place to visit as a part of their political messaging. And the Chinese people, they're avid newspaper readers. That has an impact. Now, I don't know how big the impact is, but it's just an example of where I think that messaging, the way not only our government talks about China, but the way we all talk about China and Chinese people, the rise in, there has been a rise in discussions that tend towards the racist side of putting the blame on China and wanting fewer Chinese people in the country. That hurts their feelings, and I think it should be pretty obvious that it would. And so there is an important messaging question that I think affects not just the tourism industry, but that whole analysis of why the political relationship's important, of why, and whether we should be being a little bit nicer sometimes.
Thanks, Jane. Doug, a couple of business questions for you, and I'm going to give you two at once, if that's okay, so we don't have to swap back and forth. Firstly, there is a question from Mike around whether you're seeing, or whether there's any evidence that Australian companies that have been operating in China are looking to exit and to bring operations back to Australia, or I guess anywhere else, or whether they're revisiting any plans to invest in China at this point in time. That's a bit on the negative side, but on the positive side, is there opportunity for Australian business to support and be involved in any of the Belt and Road initiatives, from this point on?
Okay, thanks, Mike. Look, not at this stage am I aware of Australian companies looking to exit China. Obviously, we've seen a lot of Australian expatriates that have got senior management positions have come home to Australia for family reasons. But the sense I get from talking to companies in China and through AusCham up there is that China still presents enormous growth opportunities for Australian companies, particularly in the services sector, and obviously the exported products that we specialise in. So why would you leave the Chinese market when there is so much growth potential still? I think that we are seeing a considerable global retake on China in a number of different ways. So there's still, in Q1, there was still a very significant uptake year on year on foreign direct investment into China's high-tech sector. I think it was up 20%. There's been a flood of global capital into China's financial market and bond market especially. So there is still relativity. There's still interest in investing into China. I know that some of the world's leading technology companies have retreated for their own reasons. But not seeing that. In terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, Australia's not on the belt or the road, which are funny to define in some respects for another chat. But we do have the opportunity, I think, to use our services capability in engineering, in capital markets, in the ability that we've lived through of recycling capital and structuring debt, and being involved in the architecture and the design. We've had a number of speakers at the Asia Society on the Belt and Road, and perhaps one of the best was a Japanese gentleman who just said, from his company's perspective, they don't think about the Belt and Road; they think about the project and the attractive parts of the project, and they go with laser focus into those areas. And I think that's the best way. So being aware of what actual projects are coming online within the Belt and Road, and going for things that you think are interesting.
Thanks, Doug. I think I really like the tone of your sort of response in terms of continuing to highlight the opportunities that exist for Australian business and the potential for Australian businesses to really benefit from the recovery and the rebound that we're seeing. And I think that's been consistent in your messaging all the way through, and a real degree of pragmatism around heeding the calls of diversification, yes, but let's not forget there's just tremendous opportunity. We can't really afford to look away from that. Jane, just before we finish, because we are winding up now, a positive note from you. Where's the glass half full in this for you?
Oh, there's so many glasses half full if you're ready to fill them up. What would I pick as the number one? I guess, I'll come back to my... Oh, I'm not muted? No. I think I'll come back to one of my opening points that, we've really seen this sort of split in the arguments about what China's good for, why it's good for us, why it's bad for us, whether we should decouple or not. And I think this really does give us, I hope, an opportunity to understand just how important the economy is and has been and will continue to be for our own growth and prosperity in the years going ahead, and that we can have, I guess, more mature conversations about how best to take advantage of those opportunities. And, Doug's pointed out a huge number of those, and you think of the recurring themes through this last hour of new technologies, the low carbon economy. I think there's a lot of hope, for me anyway, within China that government spending is directed towards the very poorest people in the country. And as I mentioned, there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of them who haven't benefited nearly as well as the super wealthy. And with money redirected towards those people, that could stimulate domestic consumption. That'll in turn be good for Australian traders in a whole range of, emerging middle class sort of consumer goods. And so, again, like Doug, I look to the opportunities, and it's not to deny that there are risks. It's not to be pro-China or anti-China, but it is to be pragmatic and look for the opportunities where they arise. And I think there are going to be plenty of them.
Well, thanks for that. I think that's the closing comments from both of you are just a fantastic way to finish here. I think we've all seen the great shock that's come from this COVID-19 crisis. Australia has, of course, been hit hard. Our dependency on China has been a very important element of that. If we can see China continue to do well in keeping the virus under control there and strengthening its economy, fingers crossed about what happens in the rest of Asia. Of course, they're a step behind at this stage, and that's critically important to China and also to us. Not to mention what's going on in the US. So still plenty of uncertainty, but hopefully this rebound in China is something of a real positive for Australia, and we don't lose sight in amongst some other noise of the real benefits that has delivered for decades and will continue to deliver to Australian business and the Australian economy more broadly, and hopefully provide some needed spark for jobs creation and things like that in the future in Australia. So thank you both so much for your time today. Thank you to our audience. We have been recording this, of course, so you feel free to review it and come back to it if you like. Share it around. It will be available on the website in due course. You can, as always, continue to engage with CEDA through all the various social media platforms that you're familiar with and that we engage with all the time. And as I said at the outset, if you want to know what's going on with CEDA, if you want to engage with all of the content that we're putting out and keep up to date with our future live streams, just go to the website ceda.com.au and you'll find a wealth of information there. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much for being a part of today's CEDA live stream. Thanks very much.